For 13 years, Patricia Bell told herself they were gone together, lost to the unforgiving mountain in a tragic accident. She mourned her husband, Michael, and her 8-year-old son, Thomas, as a single, inseparable soul. But when a geologist calls about a hiking pole unearthed by a recent landslide, that fragile piece shatters. The pole is Michael's, but the frantic engraving scratched into the metal isn't a goodbye. It's a set of coordinates and a name that isn't his son's. What would you do if a clue from the past threatened to rewrite a tragedy you'd finally made peace with? Let us know your first thoughts in the comments as we dive into this unsettling story. The grief had become a quiet house guest over the years. It no longer screamed in the middle of the night or shattered plates in fits of rage. By 2019, 13 years after Michael and Thomas had vanished into the vast wilderness of the Sierra Nevada, Patricia's sorrow had settled into the foundation of her life. It was in the extra chair at the dinner table she never moved, the faint scent of her son's laundry detergent that she swore still lingered in the hall closet, and the heavy silence that greeted her every morning. At 58, she had built a life around the empty space they had left. She worked part-time at the local library, tended to her garden, and spoke of her husband and son in the loving, tragic past tense that friends had learned not to question. They were a sad story, a local tragedy whispered about when new hikers went missing. The Bells, lost to a sudden storm on Mount Whitney. No trace ever found. The phone call came on a Tuesday, a day so painfully ordinary that its memory would later feel like a betrayal. She was watering her petunias when the phone rang, an unknown number with a Sacramento area code. She almost let it go to voicemail, but some instinct made her wipe her hands on her jeans and answer. The voice on the other end was professional, detached. A doctor. Robert Scott, a geologist with the State Survey. He spoke about erosion patterns and debris fields, words that meant nothing to her until he said, "We were surveying a section of the mountain that experienced a recent mudslide on top of an older, unmapped landslide from years back. We found something we believe belonged to your husband, Michael Bell." Patricia's breath caught in her throat. The world seemed to tilt, the scent of wet earth and flowers suddenly overwhelming. "Found something?" she repeated, her voice a faint echo of itself. After all this time? Search parties with dogs and helicopters had found nothing. Volunteers had combed those trails for months. Nothing. "A hiking pole, ma'am," Dr. Scott continued gently. "An aluminum trekking pole. It was buried deep in the old slide debris. The recent rains must have washed just enough away to expose the tip. It's remarkably preserved. The sheriff's department ran the name from the manufacturer's registration sticker. It came back to Michael Bell, her husband's favorite pole, the one with the worn cork handle he'd refused to replace." She sank onto her porch steps, the watering can tipping over and spilling a dark patch onto the concrete. Is that all?" she asked, her mind struggling to form a devastating picture of a lone pole in the wilderness, a final desperate marker of where they fell. "Not exactly, Mrs. Bell," the geologist said, his professional tone softening with something like hesitation. "There's an engraving on it, scratched into the metal, just below the handle. It looks like it was done with a rock or a knife. The sheriff has a clear photo. He'd like to send it to you." Minutes later, an email pinged on her phone. Her hands trembled as she opened the attachment. The photo showed the dull silver of the pole, caked with mud. And there, etched in ragged, desperate lines, was the engraving. It wasn't "I love you" or "Tell my family." It wasn't Thomas's name. It was a string of numbers and letters, a format she dimly recognized as geographical coordinates. And beneath them, one word, one name, scratched with the same frantic energy. Linda. Patricia stared at the screen, a cold wave of confusion washing over her grief. Linda? She sifted through every memory, every friend, neighbor, and distant cousin. There was no Linda in their life. Why would her husband, in what she could only assume were his final moments, scratch the name of a stranger onto his hiking pole? And why coordinates? It felt less like a farewell and more like a riddle. The fragile piece of her quiet, ordered grief shattered into 1,000 sharp-edged questions. For the first time in 13 years, the story she had told herself about a shared, tragic end felt wrong. She looked from the photo of the engraved pole to the framed picture on her mantelpiece, Michael and Thomas, smiling, waving from the trailhead on that clear, sunny morning in 2006. The two images didn't belong to the same story. She had a new goal now, a purpose that burned with an intensity she hadn't felt in years. She had to know what those coordinates meant. She had to know who Linda was. The first step was the easiest and the most unnerving. Patricia typed the coordinates from the photo into her computer's search bar, her heart thumping against her ribs. She expected them to point to a desolate peak, a remote canyon, or perhaps a ranger station, a logical place for a lost hiker to aim for. The satellite image that loaded on her screen was none of those things. The pin dropped not in the rugged heart of the Sierra Nevada, but hundreds of miles away, in a small, quiet town in central Oregon she'd never heard of, Pine Ridge. The coordinates didn't mark a landmark. They marked a specific residential address on a tree-lined street named Oak Avenue. A deep, unsettling chill crept over her. This wasn't a clue to a survival location. It was a destination. A home. For 2 days, she did nothing but stare at the screen, at the neat little house with blue shutters and a manicured lawn. The image felt alien, completely disconnected from the tragedy she had spent a decade internalizing. The police had been kind but unhelpful. The discovery of the pole was significant, they said, but the coordinates and the name were a mystery. Without a body, all they could do was add it to the cold case file. They had no resources to investigate a vague clue in another state. If Patricia wanted answers, she would have to find them herself. So she packed a bag. It felt surreal, packing for a trip born from a ghost's message. She told her friends at the library she was taking a week off to visit family. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. The drive north was a blur of highways and sleepless nights and cheap motels. With every mile that separated her from the familiar landscape of her grief, a new, terrifying possibility began to take root in her mind. The coordinates weren't a desperate hope for rescue. They were a plan. When she finally arrived in Pine Ridge, it was just as the online pictures had shown. Quiet. Painfully normal. She found Oak Avenue and parked her car a block away from the address, her hands slick with sweat on the steering wheel. The house looked even more serene in person. Flowers bloomed in a window box, and a wind chime tinkled softly from the porch. This was not a place of tragedy. It was a place of peace, a place where someone lived a happy life. A woman was in the front yard, kneeling over a bed of roses, a wide-brimmed sun hat shielding her face. She looked to be in her late 40s, content and at ease. Patricia's heart hammered against her chest. Was this Linda? She got out of the car, her legs feeling unsteady. She walked down the sidewalk, her mind racing, trying to form the words to ask a question so insane she could barely think it. As she drew closer, the woman looked up and smiled politely. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice friendly. Patricia's own voice was a dry whisper. I'm looking for someone. I think he might live here." She fumbled in her purse for her wallet and pulled out the old, worn photograph she always carried, a picture of her and Michael, taken on their last anniversary. She held it out with a trembling hand. "Have you seen this man?" The woman squinted at the photo, her smile faltering. A flicker of recognition crossed her face, followed by confusion. "That looks a little like my husband, Kenneth," she said slowly, "but that picture must be very old, and that's not me." Kenneth. The name echoed in the hollow space in Patricia's chest. Just then, the front door of the house opened, and a man stepped out onto the porch, holding a glass of lemonade. He was older, his hair was mostly gray, and he wore a thick beard where there had once been a clean-shaven jaw. But the eyes, the shape of his face, the way he stood, it was all horribly, impossibly familiar. He looked at the woman in the yard, then at Patricia, and his friendly expression froze. The glass of lemonade slipped from his fingers, shattering on the stone walkway. It was Michael. The world seemed to dissolve into a roaring sound in Patricia's ears. The man she had mourned for 13 years, the man she had imagined buried under snow and rock beside their son, was standing 20 feet away, alive. The official story, the shared grave, the entire foundation of her life for the last decade, it was all a lie. He stared at her, his face a mask of pure shock and terror, a deer caught in the headlights of a past that had finally caught up to him. The woman in the garden looked back and forth between them, her face etched with confusion. "Kenneth?" she said, her voice wavering. "What's going on? Who is this?" But Michael didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stood there, a ghost on his own front porch, staring at the wife he had left for dead. For a moment, nobody moved. The only sounds were the soft tinkling of the wind chime and the blood roaring in Patricia's ears. Michael, or Kenneth as he was now called, seemed to be made of stone, his face drained of all color. The woman, Linda, looked from Patricia's stricken face to her husband's terrified one, the pieces clicking together in a way that made her take a half step back. "You need to leave," Michael finally choked out, his voice raspy, unfamiliar. The sound of his voice broke Patricia's paralysis. A tidal wave of emotions, rage, grief, betrayal, crashed over her. "Leave?" she whispered, the word laced with 13 years of pain. You're alive." "I don't know who you are," he stammered, his eyes darting toward Linda. "You've made a mistake." "A mistake?" Patricia took a step forward, her voice rising, gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed. "My mistake was mourning you. My mistake was crying for you every night for years. Where is he, Michael? Where is our son?" The mention of a son made Linda gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Michael flinched as if struck. "Thomas," Patricia pressed, her voice breaking on her son's name. "What happened to Thomas?" "The rock slide. You were with him." "There was an accident," he said, his facade of denial crumbling. "It was a long time ago. I don't remember everything. I hit my head. I ended up here. I started a new life." The lie was so weak, so pathetic, that it only fueled Patricia's fury. "Amnesia? Is that the best you can do after 13 years? She held up her phone, the image of the hiking pole still on the screen. "Then explain this. Explain the coordinates to this house. Explain the name Linda scratched into the metal. You didn't forget. You ran." Seeing the proof on the phone, Michael's shoulders slumped in defeat. The fight went out of him, replaced by a shame so profound it seemed to crush him. He sank onto the porch steps, burying his face in his hands. Linda just stared, her face a canvas of horror and dawning comprehension. "Tell me what happened to him," Patricia demanded, her voice now cold and steady. "I have a right to know. He was my son." When Michael finally looked up, his eyes were filled with the tears of a man who had been running from himself for over a decade. He spoke in a low, broken mumble, the story spilling out of him in disjointed fragments. He told her there had been a rock slide, just as the initial reports guessed. It had been sudden, a crack echoing through the canyon, followed by the thunder of falling boulders. They had been trapped on a narrow ledge. Thomas, his leg had been crushed by a rock. He was alive, conscious, but badly injured and screaming in pain. Michael had tried to move the rock, but it wouldn't budge. He was panicked, trapped on an unstable slope with his bleeding son, his mind fracturing with fear. And in that moment of terror, a dark, selfish thought had taken root. This was his chance. A chance to escape a marriage that felt stale, a mortgage he couldn't afford, a life that felt like a cage. He was already having an online affair with Linda, a woman from Oregon who represented a new, unburdened beginning. He could just walk away. Everyone would assume they both perished. It would be a tragedy, but he would be free. So he did. He told his crying 8-year-old son that he was going to get help. He promised he'd be right back. And then he climbed away from the rockfall, never looking back, leaving his child to die alone on the side of a mountain. The hiking pole had been a last-second impulse, a flicker of a conscience he was trying to extinguish. He'd used his pocket knife to scratch the coordinates of the town where Linda lived, a place they had planned to meet, and her name. He didn't know why. Maybe, he mumbled, a small part of him hoped that if the pole was ever found, it might lead rescuers to Thomas's body, but without ever tracing the crime back to him. Patricia listened, her body going numb. The story was more monstrous than anything she could have ever imagined. He hadn't been a victim of the mountain, he had been the monster on it. Without saying another word, she turned her back on the man she had once loved and pulled out her phone. Her fingers were steady as she dialed 911. She asked for the Pine Ridge Sheriff's Department. When Sheriff Brian Miller answered, she spoke with chilling clarity. "My name is Patricia Bell," she said. "I'd like to report a crime. It happened 13 years ago, and the man who did it is sitting right in front of me." The aftermath was a whirlwind of police statements, legal proceedings, and reporters on her lawn. Michael was arrested immediately. His confession, combined with the evidence of the hiking pole and his fraudulent life insurance claim, made for an airtight case. He was charged with child abandonment, manslaughter, and fraud. With the information from Michael's confession, a specialized search and rescue team was dispatched to the precise location of the 2006 rockslide. It took them 3 days of careful excavation, but they found him. They found what was left of Thomas, buried beneath the same rocks his father had abandoned him to. Patricia brought her son home. She buried him in the local cemetery, in a plot right next to the empty one she had bought for Michael years ago. The funeral was small and quiet. This time her grief was different. It was sharp, clean, and directed solely at the small casket before her. There was no more confusion, no more shared tragedy. There was only her son, a victim of a terrible betrayal, and the profound, lonely sorrow of a mother who finally knew the truth. Standing at the grave, she placed a single white rose on the fresh earth. The lie she had lived with for 13 years was over. She was free from the not knowing, but the truth had left a wound far deeper than the one she'd carried before. She had found her son, but lost everything else. And in the quiet of the cemetery, she finally began to mourn him properly, not as one half of a tragic story, but as the bright, funny 8-year-old boy who deserved so much more than a father who walked away. Do you believe a person can ever truly be forgiven for an act of cowardice that costs another person their life, even if they live with the guilt for years? Share your thoughts on this difficult question below. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications. We explore complex cases like this every week, and your support helps us continue to bring these important narratives to light.